Hello, it's story time once again with Jeff Young, and today's story takes place in northern Pennsylvania during the winter, which certainly explains the background that you can see behind me. This is a story of Ole Bull, who was a fiddle player of some renown, who dreamed of establishing a new Norway in northern Pennsylvania. Ghost town still exists today, and you can find it there under the name Oleana, and we'll talk a little bit more about that after the story. But today's story is titled The Bull and the Bellsnickel. Ole wiped away the filigree of frost that formed when he breathed on the window pane of the coach. Outside in the late afternoon, the light was beginning to fail as the coach wound further up the valley. The chill of the snow-covered woods seeped through the door, balanced against the warmth thrown by the small brazier in the center of the floor. The banked coals gave a faint heat and a distinct odor that mixed with the smell of drying wools. The passengers had all joined together a few miles ago to push the coach from a drift, and they were still drying out. A flicker of motion caught his eyes in the woods near the stream. He pressed closer to the window, the sharp tang of snow and the cold air making him blink his eyes and shake his head. Ah, there was the split tree. Only 2 more turns of the road and another half-mile to Oleana. He was nearly there. Again he caught something from the corner of his eye, and suddenly there was a tall form loping along next to the coach. Bellsnickel. Truly the man was an enigma. Ole laughed briefly at the bizarre sight of him pacing the coach like some lean wolf in his animal hides, the whites of his eyes, the flash of his teeth, blazing against the dark shadows of his flesh. He still could not fathom his relationship to this odd settler, but Ole quickly drew his cane and rapped it sharply on the roof. And after a brief harangue with the driver about getting off early and procuring his assurances that his luggage would be dropped off at the store, Ole stood there in the snow beside Bellsnickel and watched the coach wobble onward on the road. He turned toward the large black man who, although he seemed very glad to meet Ole, suddenly wouldn't meet his gaze. Ole thought briefly about how he had met Bellsnickel, singing quietly over the grave of his son as Ole had just come to take possession of the very land Bellsnickel had chosen as a burial spot. Strangely, from there on, he'd always associated Bellsnickel with music. There seemed to be some tune that always was there under his breath. As he tirelessly chopped wood, there was a song that he sang that was buried under the falling of the axe. And even now the sounds of his passage seemed to have a rhythm as he slogged along through the ankle-deep snow, but it was a subdued music now. Ole remembered the moment he had caught Bellsnickel hiding in the dark listening to Ole play his violin out under the trees, with the moon shining down like some spotlight on a New York stage. The big black man had been completely wrapped and silent. And there had been a moment as he turned away when Ole finished, where the light caught his eyes, and they had glowed like a deer close to a bonfire. The other incident that made Ole wonder about Bellsnickel was the morning he had come down to the creek and found him crouched on a rock, talking to a lovely young woman who lay half in a deep pool, with only her head and shoulders visible. Her sleek black hair clung to her form as she playfully splashed water on his tall form, perched like a cormorant on a nearby rock. She'd finally swum to the far side of the creek and pulled herself out of the water to search for her clothes hidden among the skunk cabbage and tall grass. Ole had backed away, feeling like an intruder. But he thought about the stories of his homeland and was tempted to pull out the old Hardinger fiddle and ask Bellsnickel to introduce him to the lady of the stream. Some of the finest fiddle players were said to have been taught by the folk of the stream. Although he had won the hearts of many Americans with the passion of his playing, Ole knew that he did not yet have the technique of a master. He was, however, willing to learn. But other things had interrupted Ole Bull's dream. The settlers that continued to come were poorer than the rest, bringing less to the community when they arrived. And Ole found that he was putting more and more money into the community and began to realize that he might soon have to go on tour again. The trees resisted their efforts since the farmers had decided to remove them wholesale, and it was just taking too much time. Winter was fast approaching, and the farmland that had been reserved out of the deed of sale for the land mocked the settlers as they desperately tried to clear places for crops. And finally, he had no choice. He had to once again set up shows, to stride the boards, strike the bow to strings, and fiddle for his and her and their futures. But he was back now. And although his coffer was not as full as he would have liked, it was still money that could feed his people this winter. Ole looked over at Bellsnickel standing there in his buckskins moccasins sunk deep into the snow. He reached out and clapped the big man on the shoulder. The movement made the fiddle case he carried slide to his hip. Luggage he could trust to the coachman, but not his livelihood. And also there were dollars hidden in the lining of the case, and the papers where sums had been deposited in banks. He snorted briefly in the cold air as the coach drew further away. A brief smile chased across the lips of the tall man next to him. Unslinging his cane from his armpit, Ole gestured them onward. "How are the cities?" asked Bellsnickel in his deep, solid tone. "Still standing when I left, and filled with fools who are willing to pay for just to hear another full play, apparently," replied Ole as they trudged along. He wondered what was troubling Bellsnickel, but the other was such a private man. Ole felt uncomfortable even thinking about broaching the subject. After all, he owed Bellsnickel an odd debt of sort. Most of the firewood was a result of his tireless chopping, yet he consistently refused to use an iron axe, instead making do with an odd, dull bronze hatchet. He wouldn't work the saw or help with the construction of any of the houses, and apparently had no home of his own. And the little community, though, had no shortage of firewood due to his efforts, and it was one less thing to worry about as they wrestled with the land to make their little new Norway a reality. Perhaps he was working out either some anger or perhaps even the loss of his son. Ole had asked briefly once about the boy and had received an odd answer. "He is one of many sons and daughters. Sometimes I don't even remember all of them. But he has died now, and so I grieve now." Not knowing how to reply to such an odd statement, Ole had simply laid his hand on the big man's shoulder as they sat on top of the hill where Ole was wont to build his own home, Valhalla. The sun had slid slowly behind the hillsides, moving shadows through the red and golden treetops. And lost in the beauty of the moment, Ole hadn't even registered the moment when Bellsnickel had left. He stood up, put his hands on his hips, surveying the hillside, and looked at the stone foundation. And then, mindful of the beginning of the early night's chill, he had headed down the creek to where it wound along, headed down the hill to where it rounded along Kettle Creek. In fact, it was the very sound of Kettle Creek now that brought Ole Bull back to the present as it chuckled along beside them. The road was close to the bed of the creek, and Ole used his cane to be sure he wouldn't plunge into any frozen puddles. His nose twitched slightly. Surely by now he'd be able to smell wood smoke. They were alone on the road, and there was only one other bend before them before they came to Oleana. But he couldn't find any lights from the houses, glimmering the beginnings of twilight as the sun behind the western hillside slid further into night. He looked again at the Bellsnickel, who somehow managed to completely avoid his gaze by staring off into the woods. And something stirred in Ole in a vague sense of unease, no longer only brought on by his friend's treatment of him. And finally Ole could see the light of what had to be the store up ahead. He was still confused by the lack of lights around it. Against the darkening blue of the sky, the steep hill at whose base Oleana nestled in between the flow of Kettle Creek and Little Kettle Creek loomed like a dark specter. There were no lights besides the light of the store itself. Ole started forward towards the nearest house. Jacob Olbeg lived there. Trudging through the deep snow, he forced his way up to the front door. He hammered on the door once, and twice, and a third time, and the door flew inwards, spilling Ole in a drift of snow into the cold interior. Wooden furniture was scattered about, but the house was empty. There was another small drift of snow towards the rear of the house where the back door stood open. Ole got slowly to his feet. He never heard Bellsnickel approach, but when he turned, the black man filled the doorway. His right hand held the fiddle case that Ole had tossed into the snow, and the left his cane. "Where have they gone?" breathed Ole, seeming to sink in on himself. Using the cane as a pointer, Bellsnickel flung open his arm, pointing through the house at the hillside, visible through the back door. "West." "All of them?" Ole dared to ask as he turned back towards the doorway. Bellsnickel stepped backward and let him pass. "Most," was his quiet answer. He turned and followed Ole as he staggered through the snow, ignoring the road drawn onward by the light of the store. Ole took step after step into the snow, which rode up to his calves, and when he stopped, his mind awhirl at how he had foolishly been performing to the fickle masses while his dream escaped him, Bellsnickel would prod him gently until he resumed his forward progress. At the circle of light formed by the lantern hung off of the front roof of the store, he stopped and turned to Bellsnickel, now focused enough to be angry. "Why wouldn't you tell me?" Bellsnickel crooked an eyebrow. "You would have run, broken a leg. It would have been a long way to carry you in the snow. When you got here, they would still be gone." He said it dispassionately, like mentioning that the leaves had begun to drop. And it was so typical a reply that Ole stood there, his anger flooding away. In his own canted way, Bellsnickel was right. Coming to that realization, Ole became aware that he had no idea what to do next. His world had vanished overnight. He knew there had been unrest and talk of going west, but he had held on to the bright points of the letters he had received. And standing there on the porch looking at the pile of his luggage left by the coach, he felt as if the whole world had turned its back on him. Bellsnickel promptly reminded him it wasn't so. "Go inside. When you can't bear it anymore, play as you always have. Play for the wild, the heavens, for what might have been, and I will come, and I will listen, as I always have. Dreams die, Ole. That doesn't mean they weren't to live, just that their time has passed." And with that he turned and slouched down the steps into the darkness. And Ole stood there on the porch feeling more alone than ever. The light shining down on him reminded me of the lights on stage when he stood up there by himself, and how he forgot sometimes that the audience was scattered about him, and the music took him and played him instead of the reverse. When he got tired of staring at his feet, he reached up and pulled the lamp off its hanger, knocking on the door to rouse the good folks within. For now, he would like some company and warmth. Later, when the emotion he felt within him began to grow cold, he would step out onto the back porch into the snow. And he would face the direction that his scattered flock had gone and play like the Pied Piper desperate for their return. Ole was certain, as certain that the folk who had peopled his dream of New Norway would never return, that out there, under the light of the moon, reflecting off of the snow, that Bellsnickel would stop and listen to his sorrowful song. Ole knew his lips would curl into a smile, not an unkind one, but a knowing one, for surely Bellsnickel had seen his dreams die as well. In morning we would find Ole shivering in the cold, still staring westward, listening. And there would come a cascade of sound as the tree fell among its fellows over on the wooded hillside, and then the dull, repetitious thud of an axe. Some things would never change. And that is the bull and the Bellsnickel. And the bull in the story title refers to Ole Bull, who was a real person. He was a very well-known fiddle player. He was known for playing the Hardanger fiddle, which is a Norwegian instrument, which is different than a regular violin. It's a different sound. And he would tour the states and take the money from the tours and therefore apply it to purchasing land in northern Pennsylvania, up in Potter County, and try to establish a new Norway, a little Norway for his people so that they could emigrate to the United States. Unfortunately, the land in question was a lot hillier than they expected, and when they went to remove the trees, instead of cutting the tree down and removing the stump, they were trying to remove everything, and that wasn't going well, and it was taking a long, long time to do this. So things did not work out as planned, and I came up with the idea that Ole would come back after going out and trying to raise more money and discover that his people had gone. And a lot of the people in Little Norway actually emigrated out to Wisconsin, which reminded them a bit more of Norway itself. And the other character that's in the story, the Bellsnickel, is actually a sort of Pennsylvania Dutch character of German background, which is known as a little bit of a trickster or a representation of the devil himself. And I actually made him a slightly more benign character for this. If you're interested in this story, there's certainly things that you can read about. You can listen to Ole Bull's music. There's some recordings of it still available. There's a book called Oleana, the Ole Bull Colony, and I'll put the cover up for you so you can take a look at that after this. And you can even actually visit the area. And there is actually even still a store in Oleana, even though Oleana is pretty much a crossroads with not much anything other up there than hunting camps. But you can imagine it would be an interesting place to try and set up a little Norway. And if you climb all the way to the top of the hill at Ole Bull State Park, you can see the foundations of where Ole was planning on building his castle that he called Valhalla. If you are interested in hearing other stories about alternate history from me, I do have a collection called Within the Branches of Alternity. It is available as an ebook. You can find it on both Barnes & Noble and Amazon.com. Thanks for joining me this week.